There's a moment in Greylock that lasts only a few seconds. No music, no jump scares, and no monsters charging towards the camera. Just a face. It wasn't even particularly detailed. It simply looked wrong. And somehow, that image stayed with me longer than almost any horror movie I've watched this year. And that bothered me, because by now, I've seen all the distorted faces. We've seen VHS filters, emergency broadcasts, static, corrupt tapes. Analog horror has been around long enough that many of its tricks should feel familiar. So why doesn't Greylock? Why does it still manage to get under your skin? Why does it feel different? I don't think it's because Greylock has better monsters, and I don't think it's because it has better effects. I don't even think it's because the mystery is better. I think Greylock succeeds because it understands something that modern horror stories have forgotten. Fear doesn't begin when the monster appears. Fear begins the moment reality stops making sense. And Greylock understands that better than almost anything else I've watched in years. Hello everyone, my name is Falcon and welcome to What Am I Watching? Tonight I want to talk about Greylock. Not because it's another analog horror series, but because I genuinely believe it represents where analog horror should be going next. So, turn off the lights and stay a while. Let's learn a few things together, shall we? When people describe Greylock, they usually begin with the plot. A mountain, disappearances, emergency broadcasts, distorted people and things hiding in the woods. That's all true, but I don't think it's why many discussions miss what actually makes the series feel frightening. Because none of those things are the real horror, they're just the symptoms. The real horror is much quieter than that. Greylock never asks, what if monsters exist? It's asking, what if reality itself started changing and nobody understood why? And that's a much more frightening question. You see, monsters are simple. You can run from a monster. You can even fight a monster. You can lock your door. But what do you do when the thing you can no longer trust is reality itself? This is where Greylock separates itself from so much modern horror. Most horror stories introduce danger from the outside. A killer arrives or a ghost appears. A creature escapes. Something enters your life. Greylock feels different. It never feels like something has arrived. It feels like something has always been there. And people now are only just beginning to notice. That changes everything. Because now every emergency broadcast, every distorted recording, every missing person, well, it doesn't feel like another scary event. It feels like another piece of evidence. And that's a very important distinction. Greylock doesn't present horror like fantasy. It presents it like documentary. Like if someone discovered a box of tapes they were never supposed to find. Like the footage exists whether you're watching it or not. And that tiny shift changes how your brain processes everything you're seeing. You stop watching a horror story, and you start examining evidence. And once that happens, your imagination begins to do half the work of the series. That may actually be Greylock's greatest strength. It trusts you, the audience. It trusts that you're going to notice things it refuses to explain. It trusts that silence can be more unsettling than explanation. It trusts that showing you less can make you imagine far, far more. And that's becoming incredibly rare. Because modern horror often feels afraid of uncertainty. Every mystery eventually gets an answer. Every creature a backstory. Every haunting gets an explanation. Greylock resists that temptation. And instead, it quietly asks you a question. What if understanding what's happening wouldn't make you feel any safer? What if it only made things worse? Because once that thought enters your mind, every scene begins to change. And that's where I think Greylock stops being an analog horror series and starts becoming something much more unsettling. The fear isn't that something's chasing you. The fear is that the world you've trusted your entire life is slowly becoming unrecognizable. And by the time you've noticed, it may already be too late. Misunderstandings are common. I think the biggest mistake people make when thinking about Greylock is assuming the monsters are the point, and they're not. In fact, if you removed every creature from this series, Greylock would still be unsettling, because the mountain itself isn't the real antagonist. And that might sound strange. After all, Mount Greylock doesn't move. It doesn't speak. It surely doesn't chase anyone. But think about the way the series treats it. Everything happens because of the mountain. People disappear around it. Authorities begin losing control around it. Reality begins breaking apart around it. The mountain isn't simply the setting, it's the source. Almost like an ancient wound that's been sitting quietly underneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice it. And I love that Greylock never treats the mountain like a haunted house. It treats it like a force of nature. You wouldn't call gravity evil if you fell, and you wouldn't call the ocean malicious if you got hit by a wave. They're simply things that exist. Nature. Whether we understand them or not. Greylock gives that mountain the same indifference. It doesn't hate humanity. It simply doesn't care about it. And somehow, that is far more frightening. The idea naturally leads into something I think sits at the heart of the entire series. Condemnation. Not infection in the traditional horror sense. Not zombies or parasites and not disease. It's something much stranger. The feeling that reality itself has become contaminated. Watch how Greylock presents its world. People don't simply disappear. Conversations become uncertain. Broadcasts become unreliable. Faces become incorrect. Places that should feel familiar suddenly don't. It's almost as if the rules holding reality together have started to loosen. That's why I don't think Greylock is really asking, what is the monster? I think it's asking, what happens when the world stops behaving the way you know it should? A far more terrifying question. Because monsters still obey rules. But when reality doesn't, what do you do? One of my favorite details in Greylock is how often information arrives incomplete. An interrupted broadcast or a corrupted tape, a distorted photograph or missing audio. Something important happens and the audience never gets the whole picture. Some find that frustrating, but I think it's brilliant. That's how real disasters unfold. Imagine a town experiencing something impossible. Nobody would have every camera angle. Nobody would have perfect information. Nobody would fully understand what they're seeing. People would collect fragments, rumors, and pieces of evidence, half-finished recordings, an angle that doesn't quite capture everything. And they'd spend years trying to assemble those pieces into something that makes sense. And that's exactly what Greylock asks us to do. Not because it wants to confuse us, but because confusion is the experience. The audience is losing certainty alongside them, and that's incredibly difficult to accomplish. That also explains why Greylock's creatures stay frightening. Modern horror has a habit of treating monsters like collectibles. Eventually, you'll get the full reveal. Front, side, the back, lore, weaknesses, an origin story. And once that happens, the mystery starts disappearing. Greylock refuses to give you that comfort. Instead, its creatures remain incomplete. Sometimes you only see them for a moment. Others you'll only hear from them. And sometimes they move in ways your brain immediately recognizes as impossible or wrong. Our brains spend our entire lives learning how people move, how faces behave, and how voices sound. Greylock quietly breaks those expectations. Not dramatically, but just enough to reach that uncanny valley. And because it never fully explains what you're looking at, your imagination begins solving the puzzle that has no solution. And that's why the images can stay with you so long. Not because they're graphic, but because they're unresolved. You want to make something out of them. Something that you just can't understand. This is where I think Greylock quietly surpasses many other analog horror projects. It doesn't rely on VHS filters to create fear. The filter creates authenticity. The fear comes from somewhere else. It comes from implication, from silence. It comes from the feeling that every answer only creates a larger question, and that's a difficult balance to maintain. Most stories feel less frightening the longer they continue, but Greylock somehow manages the opposite. The more evidence you collect, the less confident you become. Every tape answers one question, while quietly creating 2 or 3 more. And that's a fantastic way for a mystery to unfold. And all of this brings us back to something I mentioned at the very beginning. Greylock is not about the monsters. The monsters are evidence. The broadcasts are evidence. The disappearances and even the mountain itself, evidence that holds something fundamental. That something has gone wrong with reality itself. And if that's true, then maybe the most disturbing thing in Greylock isn't whatever lies inside the mountain. Maybe it's the simple act of trying to understand it, because every person who gets closer to the truth seems to lose a little more of the world they thought they understood. And once that idea starts settling in, the horror stops feeling fictional, and it starts feeling disturbingly possible. Something occurred to me after finishing Greylock. Not immediately. It was one of those thoughts that quietly settled in over the next few days. I wasn't thinking about the monsters anymore. I wasn't even thinking about the individual scenes. I wasn't trying to solve the mystery. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something about the world of Greylock itself had felt possible. Not quite realistic, but possible. And I think there is an important difference. The greatest horror stories have never been about the one that simply frightened us. They've always reflected the fears of the times that they were created. Dracula arriving during an age of terrified outsiders. Godzilla reflected a fear of nuclear destruction, disaster. The Cold War gave us stories about paranoia, about not knowing who you could trust. And even cosmic horror wasn't really about monsters. It was about humanity discovering that it wasn't nearly as important as it believed. Every generation invents the horror that it needs. So what does Greylock say about ours? I don't think we're living in an age that fears vampires, or haunted castles, or monsters hiding under the bed. I think we're living in an age where reality itself feels less stable. Every day we're surrounded by information we can't verify, videos that we don't know are real, artificial voices and images, algorithms deciding what we see, conspiracy theories, misinformation, half-truths. We're constantly asking ourselves a single question. Can I trust what I'm looking at? Greylock takes that anxiety and turns it into horror. It doesn't ask what if monsters existed. It asks, what if reality slowly stopped making sense? And nobody could agree on when it started. And that's a much more modern fear. And I think that's why Greylock resonates with so many people. There's something beautifully restrained about that. Because Greylock never screams. It whispers. It doesn't force terror into the audience. It invites the audience to participate, to notice details, to question them, to doubt them, to slowly become uncertain. And once uncertainty takes hold, the horror grows on its own. The series trusts something that many modern horrors don't. It trusts you. Your imagination, your curiosity, your ability to connect pieces that aren't fully explained. Ironically, that's what makes it feel so real. Reality rarely gives us complete answers, and neither does Greylock. Maybe that's why analog horror has become so powerful over the years. People often think VHS filters are the point, or the distorted faces, or emergency broadcasts. Those things matter, but they're only tools. The real innovation of analog horror is that it presents horror as evidence, not as entertainment. It doesn't feel like someone telling you a ghost story. It feels like someone handing you a box of tapes and quietly saying, I don't know what's on these, but I think you should see them. That changes the relationship between storyteller and the audience. You're no longer watching events unfold. You're investigating them. You're participating. And participation creates investment. Investment creates imagination. And imagination has always been horror's greatest special event. That's why I think Greylock represents something important. Not because it's the scariest analog horror series ever made. People will argue about that forever. And not because it has the best creatures, or the most complicated mythology, but because it understands where horror is going. Away from spectacle. Away from constant explanation. Away from monsters that simply exist to be defeated, and back towards uncertainty, towards atmosphere and implication, towards the terrifying realization that understanding something doesn't always make it less frightening. Sometimes it makes it worse. So, why do you think Greylock feels so different? I don't think it's because it reinvented analog horror. I think it's because it remembered something that horror had quietly forgotten. The unknown isn't frightening because we don't understand it. The unknown is frightening because our minds will always imagine something worse than certainty could ever provide. Greylock understands that far too well. It understands that the mountain doesn't need to move to feel alive. A face doesn't need to scream to feel wrong. A monster doesn't need to chase you to be frightening, if reality itself has already turned against you. And that's why I believe Greylock lingers far after the screen goes dark. Not because it convinces you monsters are real, but because, for just a moment, it convinces you that reality itself might be far stranger than you've ever allowed yourself to believe. I want to thank you all for making it this far into the video. I always enjoy sitting down and talking about stories like this because they're more than just entertainment. They're reflections of things that we fear, even if we don't always realize it. If you've enjoyed this discussion, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Greylock represents the future of analog horror? Or is there another series that stayed with you even longer? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here and you enjoy horror that lingers, consider subscribing. It helps a small channel like mine. Let me know if you liked the video with a thumbs up. Because this channel isn't really about explaining horror. It's about understanding why certain stories refuse to leave us. Thank you all for staying as long as you did. And remember, do your research before you hike that new mountain. And that's my phone. And that's my phone again. Okay.